It scared him, and he raised his head and looked around. Madak was standing beside the jeep, relieving himself in the sand. The sun had cleared the eastern mountains and was already smaller and hotter. Looking down, his little pile of rocks seemed remarkably far away, and this pleased him. The ledge was not more than a foot wide, but the stone slab which had once been a part of it had broken off clearly so that the top of the ledge was almost perfectly flat. Twisting his body and pulling with his hands, he got the slingshot and sandals around where he could handle them. The sandals looked thick and clumsy in the daylight, and he decided that they were too hazardous. His bare feet were also hazardous. The blood could cause him to slip, and when he was higher on the butte, this could kill him. He opened the fly of his shorts and tore them along the seam until he could work them out from under him and then down off his legs. Once off, he tore them in half. The ledge was so narrow and his perch on it so insecure that he did not do a very good job of wrapping the pieces of his shorts around his feet and tying them, but when he had finished, he knew what walking could would not be as clumsy with his sandals, although it would be more painful. Holding his hands flat against the rock, his shoulders pressed against it, he pushed himself up until he was on his feet, spread-eagled as he faced outward. Madak was now sitting on the hood of the jeep, scanning the range of the mountains with the binoculars, easing himself along first one foot and then the other, his back pressing against the stone face. He went upward along the ledge, his hands always in contact with the stone. For 40 or 50 feet it was slow but easy going, the ledge neither widening nor narrowing. His bandaged feet shuffled along the thin dust, turning into a damp brown mud which quickly dried. Looking down, Ben guessed that he had moved up 10 or 15 feet on the ledge incline so that he was now about 30 feet above the breccia. The ledge ended sharply at a great vertical crack in the butte. Standing at the end of the ledge and craning his neck around the corner, Ben could see that it was a crack, an open chimney too wide to jump across and with nothing to land on the other side. With his back against the rock, he could not look up. So, holding carefully, he turned around so that his chest and knees and stomach were against the butte. It gave him an odd shivering feeling to stand this way, his naked back to Madak, his face pressed against the stone. Again he felt his flesh trembling as he waited for the first touch of the bullet. The only sound was of the birds wheeling around high above him. The crack was wedge-shaped wide across the outside with two walls coming together on the inside. The width of the crack where he stood was been estimated about 6 feet wall to wall. The crack was about 15 feet deep. Above him it seemed to go right to the sky without changing in shape, a straight vertical V of stone, an open-sided chimney, the walls very smooth, almost slippery looking, and since they were not yet in sunlight, impossible to see clearly. Although he had not noticed it as he moved through the ledge, he could now see that it curved a little outward, and as he looked back along it, discovered it had petered out at the lower end, coming finally to a point which blended into the stone face about 10 feet above the ground. Leaning over as far as he could, he looked down the dark chimney. It shocked him. Although he knew that it could not be more than 30 or 40 feet to the bottom, it looked immensely farther than that, a terrifying distance. To fall down it would kill you. A dark space, the sunlight seeming to have been cut off by a knife as it lay on the sharp stones jumbled together and then ended in blackness. Craning his head back, he looked up along the wall. There was nothing, for as far up as he could see the stone face was smooth, almost glassy in the sunlight, smooth and golden looking. He did not see a place where he could get so much as a finger grip on the stone. To be sure, he lowered his head, resting it against the wall, and reached up with his hands, feeling all over the stone above him. There was no grip there. Lowering his arms, he looked again at the wide mouth of the V. It seemed wider now. His guess of 6 feet across the other wall seemed short 7, 8. Turning his shoulder pressed against the wall, he moved until he was standing sideways, his feet together on the narrow ledge, his side hugging the wall, as he faced the wide opening of the V. Far away in another world, he heard the Jeep's starter grinding, then grinding again. Finally, the motor started, with Madec gunning and choking it. He didn't handle motors well. Without looking back, Ben inched forward until the front pads of his feet were over the edge of the ledge and only half his arches and his heels touched the stone. Then he let himself fall. Holding his body stiff, his arms out ahead of him, his hands flat open, he fell toward the far wall of the V. Something was wrong. Something was happening to that he had not expected. It was all wrong, and there he was, nothing he could do about it now. Then he realized that he had fallen out of the sunlight and was in the darkness of the V. His hand struck the far wall with much more force than he had expected, and even as his palms and finger pads strained to grip the smooth wall, the weight of his falling body came against them. He felt his hands skidding down and could not stop them. Ben tried desperately not to let his body sag, to keep his back straight and flat so that he could ram power against his feet, which were still on the cut of the ledge. His hands against the far wall, Ben hung there, slowly sliding down, his body stretched out at full length, the muscles of his stomach gradually loosening and breaking the rigid bridge his body formed as he lay straight across the open end of the V. He could not hold it. His stomach muscles were jerking again, giving up and letting his body sag downward to add to his sliding weight to the thin pressure on his hands. Below him he could see the exact cut-off line of the sunlight, the stones in it sharp and strongly marked by shadow, the stones directly below him only dim shapes in the shade. Somehow, never knowing how he did it, but knowing he could never do such a thing again, Ben flung himself in toward the angle of the V. As his body moved, he turned it, rolling over in the air, his feet scampering along the stone on one side and his outreaching hands scrabbling against on the other. He wound up 5 feet below the ledge, on his back, suspended from his hands and feet, which were pressed against the stone, his little bundle of leaves and the slingshot lying on his belly. He arched his back, putting more pressure against the palms of his hands and the soles of his feet, moving only one hand or 1 foot at a time, and moving them only an inch or so before slamming the pressure back against them, the edge deeper into the angle of the V, moving until the top of his head scraped the stone and on his head hard against his chest and his shoulders touched stone, and on until he was compressed into the V, his back against one wall, his knees up against the other. Ben did not look either up or down as he began working his way higher, the rock face cruel against the skin of his back, and as he ground his way up. All of his flesh hurt so that he could not even tell whether the stone grinding the skin off his back was more painful than the skin being ground from his knees and shins and the tops of his feet. His tongue was now swollen that it filled his mouth and overflowed, a huge purple blob of throbbing, peeling meat outside his mouth, half clogging his nose. His lips had shreds of flesh hanging from them. It seemed to him that somebody with a little blowtorch was shooting a tip of the flame into the corners of his eyes, and he kept trying not to blink, for there was no moisture to ease the lids across the eyeballs, and so they scraped across them dry and dusty. What air he could draw in through his half-clogged nose felt like flowing flame going up past his eyes and down his throat, burning away the skin. He wanted desperately to look up to see how much further he had to go, but he had forced himself not to raise his head, fearing that the distance left would defeat him. After a while he seemed to be wrapped in a hard casing of pain. There was no sound anywhere except the sound of his choked breathing. There was no light anymore. There was no distinct feeling, no reaction of hands and fingers against the rock. There was nothing but pain. Time stopped and distance became meaningless. He thought of nothing, for it now took no thought to move what had to be moved to advance his body up the stone. It was a slow rhythm, one muscle after another, one bone and then the next, over and over, on and on, forever. Ben was not even aware that for some inches now his shoulders had been touching nothing, and he almost fell when the pressure of his legs pushed his bare butt out onto the level, and the change of pressure pitched him forward so that he was hanging head down, teetering and rocking up the upper end of the V, 200 feet of emptiness below him. It was sunlight that finally made him stop. His automatic weak pushings and gropings, the light burned his eyes when at last he opened them and looked around, his sight blurred and hazy. Half rolling, half sliding along, he moved out of the sun and into the shade, and there he collapsed, lying awkwardly on a flat area of stone, some birds coming down close to look at him.